in macro, so remember, we had the beta test of tariffs. Colombia capitulated and said, we didn't want to take those deportees, but you threatened us with tariffs. We will stand by it. And then they capitulated, and Colombia decided that they'll retaliate with tariffs. But, oh no, that one didn't work too well for Colombia. And so they decided to take those deportees, and they got back to trading together without tariffs. So we know that this is a temporary negotiation tactic, and there is a narrative control to ensure that the threat always wins, so that more and more negotiations can happen. So this week we had the 25% tariffs on Mexico, Canada, and a 10% tariff on China. We've talked about this in many episodes. So, you know, the Opium Wars, which was the British technique of destroying China, that now they came back with a revenge, because the Opium Wars, which is why HSBC was created in order to get China addicted to drugs. Well, China created their own industry, and they were exporting, and we found out with US aid that actually US aid was subsidizing groups like the Taliban in Afghanistan in order to ensure that the drugs were getting through, because we know that the CIA was created in order to protect these human trafficking and drug trafficking rings. But China has been exporting legal drugs. Those legal drugs have been making their way into Mexico. Mexico has been working with the cartel and the CIA in order to distribute those fentanyl drugs and ever iterations. And the different cartels over time that led to the creation of the CIA, which was in New York, the Jewish mobs, as well as the Italian mobs, as well as the Mexican drug cartels, and the CIA that was finding a way of having no congressional oversight in order to allow these corporate networks. They could pretend that they're servicing the national interest when they're serving corporate interest, allowed these drugs to all get through. And so as a result, Trump decided, we're going to use the army in order to protect those borders, and we're going to use tariffs in order to make it look like we got a deal that had already been negotiated. And so if you look at December last year, the deal that was announced with Canada was already agreed in December last year. But this little bit of theatrics needs to go through, where they say, we slap this tariffs, you retaliate, and then we'll hold off those tariffs, and we'll just announce a deal that we had already negotiated as well. And America can feel like, hey, this tariff wars is working. As they shrink the economy, go into an isolationist movement, which will require many of the things, and a slow removal, like the British Empire in World War I, of a reduction in the dependency upon the dollar as a world reserve currency, in order to a reform within America and move to a more nationalist, isolationist movement that the Federal Reserve and the globalists won't want. And we have this battle between the Trump administration and Federal Reserve that I've been covering for all of this in previous episodes of Bitcoin Hard Talk. Anyway, because of that, there was a real tariff on China and a temporary tariff on Mexico and Canada, and then an announcement of the capitulation like we had in Colombia, but based upon a deal that had already been negotiated. So let's go through the events. So Canada was the first one to come through. And so they were going to have a 25% tariff. Canada then said, respect our sovereignty. We'll respond with our own tariff. And 62% of US crude imports, they come from Canada. And so a 10% tariff, because there was a bit of a tiered approach, on oil that came from imports in Canada, that is also refined in order to turn it into diesel, would have a catastrophic impact on the industries that need it most. And what is the backbone of the US economy? that would be absolutely destroyed by higher diesel prices. Well, we saw this already during when Putin and Saudi Arabia colluded in order to punish the Biden administration, push the prices of oil up, which led to the Fed hiking rates, which broke Silicon Valley Bank and led to that socialization of the bank unrealized liabilities. We know what happened. Well, the industries that were affected were the truckers in America and the truckers in Canada. The Canadian truckers fought back with cryptocurrency, and Canada implemented, completely oppressive regimes in order to try and confiscate people's cryptocurrency and stop those resistance, while America was allowed to continue. But those diesel prices created that cost of living crisis. The US dollar proof of weapons network created inflation up to 9% and exported inflation up to 900% in Zimbabwe, and higher rates across the allies as well, despite those. So if this was allowed to go through and the tariffs actually happened, diesel prices would go through the roof in the US. And you would have basically the Canadian Prime Minister, Trudeau, said, we're going to impose those 25% tariffs. The announcement was that will happen on $155 billion worth of American goods. If you take the diesel out, there is actually a surplus between the Canada and US relationship. So all of this was narrative in order to, posture this tariff war to go for the next one, which is China and Europe. But anyway, the trucking industry is the backbone of the US economy because it exports goods all around internally. And this would massively impact the farmers. The farmers would then need a subsidy, and there would be massive economic impact in both Canada and America. But hopefully they decided that we'll just pause on that, and we'll announce the policy around the border, accelerate that, and get more of these deportations and more of this protection of the American border, which was exactly the policy that Trump got voted upon. That was negotiated under the Biden administration and now can be executed under the Trump administration. So you get to understand these different types of things. Remember, Trump wants to bring down the price of oil. And we'll go through a little bit more of that as well. But anyway, there is no other source in the short term that America can get its diesel from other than Canada. And so as we move to the next stage of posturing, we'll see whether any tariffs actually happened. But inevitably, they abandoned, the implementation of the tariffs, and the border protection deal was done with the budget that was announced in December for protecting the border. Now, Mexico came at the same time, and Mexico was next. So we had all the posturing with Canada. The Mexico announcement. Now, Mexico is heavily dependent upon gasoline and natural gas imports from the US, and they have no decent alternative in the short term. So they have less power than Canada because they didn't have the surplus part if you take out the diesel and oil imports. And so essentially they announced that they're going to protect the border. Additional resources are going to come from Mexico and US in order to take on the cartel. And we had the US aid announcement exposing that it was America in the first place that was funding through these NGOs and corruption, this open border policy. And more will be exposed. And everyone gets to realize what I had been announcing all along, if you follow me on X, that actually through the Fed proof of weapons network, the largest exporter of global terrorism is the Federal Reserve by the deep state. And it happens outside of Congress. And this illusion of democracy left and right is a distraction when all of the big stuff is happening there, and expose the deep state. And that's why I said, focus on Trump is the best shot. I'm not sure if he's going to do it, but we seem to be having this changing environment. I remain skeptical, but a lot has happened. In fact, more than I thought would happen is happening. And so the agreed deportation was agreed with the Mexican side. And this is a good one. Making other countries call the Mexican drug cartels terrorists so that we don't have this agenda of the Israel policy through clean break memo, where they artificially created, where the USAID and other groups were funding these fake terrorist groups in order to combine it with their words that they created, like Islamist, which was their own agents that were being used in order to create the fake war and terror, justified through 9/11. And in order to create the clean break memo, which was Netanyahu's US foreign policy, in order to de-topple the Middle East region, give Israel more power by killing more and more people, which kicked off with the Iraq war. And then WikiLeaks, funded by Bitcoin, exposed everything. And Americans got to see if they were paying attention. But now, rather than that one-sided agenda, they can call the Mexican drug cartels terrorists. And we get this exposure of the CIA's role in this whole thing. But it's kind of done through, different means. The money will still flow to the next place. But these are very positive signs. By using the word terrorism for a different agenda, gets really a little bit of a soft war against the fake war on terror that is being weaponized by Israel at the moment, and US foreign policy and various other regions in Europe as well. Anyway, in terms of retaliation, Canada had way more options than Mexico, but the real one is actually China, because everything, I repeat, everything is about trying to take down the fact that China came up with a better policy than the IMF terrorism funded by all of this covert operations, which was use the IMF strategy of getting countries debt dependent, but don't do what the economic hitmen at the IMF and the deep state do, which is allow them to govern their country and continue to invest, but don't regime change and don't benefit from funding colored wars and fake revolutions and replace democracies with dictators and try and bribe people. Just allow the countries to govern as they govern, but make them somewhat dependent upon some of the money that's being lent to them through the Belt and Road Initiative. That created 150 countries globally that wanted to work with China instead of the IMF. And so America had to fight back and destabilize these regions, use the IMF strategy, and then they can force them into saying, stop working with China. And so while China's investing in all this infrastructure and building up economies, but creating dependency upon them by funding infrastructure and allowing them to govern as they choose, the IMF is looking to de-topple them and kill more people and replace any growth with just carnage. And so that's what we saw in Bangladesh. That's what we saw in Pakistan, a failed attempt in Venezuela, a failed attempt in Hungary, a failed attempt in Brazil, where Elon Musk would use X in order to say you need to topple these regimes, install a US puppet, failed in Georgia, succeeded in Ukraine, and hence why we're at war. And the old strategies are just becoming less and less. And so they decide, I think, to capitulate and said, let's just expose the corruption, tell America what's really happening, and blame it on the Democrats. This has been happening since 1961 on the left and the right by both Republicans and Democrats. But we get to use this narrative and say, hey, we're going to and I welcome this. Look, if you're going to politically use it as long as we get the desired outcome. But anyone that's watching Bitcoin Hard Talk, I'm going to tell you the truth as I see it, as I follow the money. This was happening, both Democrats and Republicans. But because it hit a peak where more and more people were understanding what's happening, they couldn't hide it anymore. So they had to capitulate. And the Trump administration can just say, let's use Elon Musk and X. Let's expose it. Let's get the files out there and just say it was the Democrat Party so that we can gain political score, and they deserve the political score, to be quite frank. But we're still not going to fall it. We're not going to fall for it because there's other organizations that we'll be covering, like NED, the National Endowment of Democracy, that is responsible for more death, terror, and destruction than any organization in the world. You think the UK aid stuff that's got child trafficking, sex trafficking, drug trafficking, when you see the state-sponsored part of that, we need to see what comes out of NED next as well. And hopefully that new organizations will be created anyway. But hopefully this is a movement towards, we're just going to trade with you instead of killing you. And that's good for everybody. Good for America, because the gig is up. Everyone knows what's happening. And you get to expose the corruption, take the brownie points, and show those Democrats were so corrupt. Win-win, win-win, win-win. Hopefully we can get that. Anyway, China was always next. And that's what the real, the real thing is to try and take down the Belt and Road Initiative using the IMF tactics. And they need you to believe that there is a communist threat, an immigration threat, and a war on terror. And by engineering all those things through US aid, through the deep state, using the money printing of the Federal Reserve, you suffer all the inflation, and the large companies get to profit from it, and we get all this wealth inequality that funds the globalists, and then the globalists get to take that profit and hedge with other countries anyway, so that if you're doing an America First policy, we don't really care because we profit from all sides. And that is the Federal Reserve, and that's why Americans need to end the Fed, because it's no longer America First from my perspective, from following the money. Anyway, remember at the very beginning of the NATO expansion that led to a Russian invasion, and then they used all the media to make you think you need to wave Ukrainian flags as you sent more money into Ukraine, which was corrupted, and much of it was kept in America, and then siphoned off by Ukrainian oligarchs, and then used in order to kill Ukrainian people, and then make you feel like you need to send more and more and more, while the UK is still playing the game. It's all been exposed, and Keir Starmer's still trying to hold on to the game. We're going to sign a 100-year agreement to protect Ukraine so that our military-industrial complex can make more money, and we can kill more Ukrainians, and we can say it's that Putin that's doing it. The whole gig's up now. Anyway, if you remember one of the tactics that was used during the invasion, Canada used the invasion into Ukraine, and Trudeau came out and announced that it is going to ban all crude oil imports from Russia to Canada. But when you follow the money, Canada didn't import anything from Russia, so they get to use that announcement and make it look like they're, fueling the narrative and they're the moral high ground. Even though they just didn't change economically anything, and we saw that it strengthened the Russian economy, and you need to go further into sanctions. That led to de-dollarization and drew Russia and China together, which is the worst US foreign policy strategy that exists, which is why it's a problem when you have a corrupted Congress that's following a Israel first strategy that doesn't have the same interests as Americans, and the Federal Reserve is a globalist organization. I hope you can figure all this out as we move to hopefully pushing back against this. Anyway, follow the money, don't follow the narrative, and I'll keep reporting it every week. So now China is essentially doing the same. They came back and said, we're going to have tariffs on oil and LNG imports from the US. But China's not importing any oil or LNG from the US because Trump has a strategy, which is push the price of oil down in order to try and harm the Iranian economy and the Russian economy. But China's saying, okay, all our oil comes from Iran and Russia and various other regions and our Belt and Road Initiative, because we're not toppling regimes. And that's where all of our oil, and if you can get that price down, we'll benefit. What will happen to the American economy? It will bankrupt the oil importers because they can't do it at the same price as OPEC. The Middle East wins, Russia wins, Iran wins, and China wins. And that's why Iran and Russia had to sign that strategic agreement, both economically and militarily, to protect against the Israel first strategy that could end up causing a lot of harm to the American economy. Anyway, so China responded with US tariffs, and that's the state of affair where we are right now. But an interesting trend happened. They decided to issue a complaint to the World Trade Organization. And so China, which has a narrative of not following, the Western narrative of they don't follow international law, they don't respect intellectual property. That's correct. They're open source. The open source DeepSeek is just an indication. They don't care about intellectual property. They don't care about copyright. They don't care about protecting trademark monopolies. They have a very competitive environment, but they also have a state banking system, and they use their state banking system and oil resources to reduce the amount of tax that people need to pay. And then they can, harness some of the debt crisis if they lever up their banking system too much. I'll go through a little bit of the stats because, we have this whole thing. We got to question narratives, right? In order to create this perception that China's just about to reunify with Taiwan, and therefore the NATO need to expand, and you, Korea, and you, Philippines, and you, Japan, you need to print more money and spend it more so that it can buy more dollars, and then we can prop up US dollar debt and our industry to sell more weapons. We need you to believe that China's about to reunify with Taiwan, and we need to protect it to create World War III. Now, those events, the deep state could win. The deep state would love that because they're hedged. They're hedged. But it would be awful for America. It would be awful for China. It would create trillions of dollars of economic destruction, and it could trigger off World War III. You better have some Bitcoin to try and protect yourself through that, and in a long-term way, because there'll be a lot of volatility all around if it gets there. But anyway, China decided they're going to use international agreements. And, obviously the UK aid again came out and revealed, Biden pardoned Fauci, and Fauci had bioweapons that were funded through UK aid in order to create bioweapons within a lab in Wuhan. And the China virus was the America virus, and an operation in order to sell lots of profits for Big Pharma at the expense of the death and destruction of lots of people. All of that is out now. Now, before this would have led to my video getting taken off, I'm hoping that now this is fact, we don't need to worry about the same level of censorship when they didn't want you to know this because they wanted you to fall for it. So America is now violating all these international agreements. So it's flipped. America's going for isolationism. And I welcome America first because I believe that the key is multipolar as we go through. But in the America first nationalist agenda of the Trump administration, the US has now pulled back from NATO. Thank you. That's a scam for the profits of the military industrial complex. It's not about defense, it's about attack. They pulled back from the Paris Accords and decide to focus on drill, baby, drill. China made the most investments there. Germany made a significant amount of it, wrecked the European economy because the CIA blew up Nord Stream pipeline. The ECB was exerting a non-Germany first policy, got them to turn off all their nuclear power plants, which would have protected them, destroyed the economy, ruined their manufacturing base, and created rampant inflation so that all of the euros that are created through the Eurodollar system are lent to the American government. And the ECB has a Fed first policy that was not favoring European people, destroyed the economy, and they were investing in Paris Accords, therefore they ended up with all of this investment that wasn't quite where everything's going as AI came out and everybody said, we need more and more energy. And thankfully, China gave us DeepSeek so that we now have the potential of enough energy for artificial intelligence. And hopefully we can get that open source and decentralized, because America wants to own it, China wants to own it, and America's funding $500 billion into deep state CIA operative Larry Saunders in order to get some more inflation in America, to make sure that that model can be followed, where you can centralize the artificial intelligence, to control the data, to push for a propaganda agenda, which obviously China would like to do, but they're now going open source. And so this is good for the consumer. Everything gets cheaper, more open source, more transparency, less power to the proof of weapons network. We have to be aware of it. We have to fight back against it. America has now pulled back from the World Health Organization that was responsible for that scam that we now know was a complete scam. They pulled back from USAID, which is where all the corruption goes and the funding goes. And they decided to sanction the International Criminal Court. Why? Because the International Criminal Court had classified both Putin and Netanyahu as war criminals. And so any country that hosts Netanyahu for his genocide that we now know has turned 2.3 million Palestinians into 1.7 million Palestinians, 600,000 disappeared based upon the latest stats and the latest data. Trump needs to make this war criminal and suddenly switch the narrative. Do you remember when they did this last time? They switched the narrative. We had a death counter on TV. We were all told if we don't inject ourselves immediately, then we're all going to die and we're grandma killers. And suddenly they sold enough vaccines. They got the booster and the booster and the booster. And then suddenly they tell you, oh, that doesn't matter. You're not going to die from that anymore. Get out and help Ukraine. And the narrative all became about Ukraine, Ukraine, Ukraine. And Zelensky managed to get all of this money laundering to kill more Ukrainians in order to try and weaken the Russian side and pull back from all the Cold War agreements and unwound everything based upon a CIA operation and a coup that came from that. And now, if the court decides to use it in line with the American agenda, i.e. Putin, then it's okay. We use international law. But if it's used against Netanyahu, then suddenly we need to sanction the International Criminal Court. And so now you're getting sanctions of the International Criminal Court and an attack on South Africa. Why South Africa? Because South Africa got the ICJ, which is the highest international criminal court of justice, and where there was all that Israel bribing the judge, and they're threatening to kill their family through Mossad, and that was exposed. That judge released it. It's got 18 different judges. They unanimously, with the exception of one, voted that this is plausible genocide, and so they now need to be sanctioned, and South Africa was heading up the case. And so in America's Israel first policy, they're now sanctioning the International Criminal Court and saying to South Africa, we're going to tariff your economy. You've got your own things that are going on. And then we use Elon Musk to push out the narrative that we want, whether true or not, just like we did in UK. Whether true or not, we can take a Mossad operative like Tommy Robinson. We can use that to create fake war on terror 2.0 narrative. And they're doing the same with the South African narrative as well. So weaponizing atrocities in order to create a environment that leads to the agenda through all of this political financing. The gig is up. I can talk. I'm so glad I can hopefully talk about this more openly now. And hopefully YouTube is going to give us traffic again if we can get above that 100,000 subscribers, as they completely oppressed the growth rate that we were having as soon as I started talking about some of these things. But now it's their agenda, because now the agenda is isolationism in order to reveal and make people think it's the Democrats only. Anyway, so this week there was hosting of Netanyahu as well. This is a complete alignment between the Israel and America policy. And now essentially we're just waiting for China's response to tariffs and what happens with the World Trade Organization and what it actually means to the world if America pulls out of United Nations and they don't get a veto vote anymore. Remember, the only reason the Palestinians don't have self-determination is because America would use the United Nations to veto vote the entire world that was standing up for Palestinian self-determination so that Israel could expand, so they could destabilize the region, and so they could ensure that there is no competing power to the dollar and force up the price of the dollar through the petrodollar, the euro dollar, and the various other operatives. Okay. They're going to really push a narrative that China is deep in debt. And China does have a part of its state banking system that moved to a private banking system. But because they got a big chunk of the state banking system, you can't analyze it with the same Federal Reserve proof of weapons network Ponzi scheme. The Fed is a private company that serves the interest of the global banks, and a state banking system where PBOC may be oppressive, may not have freedom of speech like you have, but it does have a state banking system which has a different level that can be utilized in ensuring that you don't get inflation, transitory pump and dump schemes, hiking rates, and excessive indebtedness, where you can socialize the losses and pretend that it's still capitalism, but not have a state banking system. So none of the benefits go to the state, but all of the losses go to the state, as it is with the Federal Reserve System. But it has that state banking system. So they're going to tell you China's screwed. China's in debt. And the Belt and Road Initiative is what we need to fight against. And we saw that as well. Look, this is countries acting in their own interests. And I don't mind. As long as they don't weaponize the proof of weapons network and do all the death and destruction, I'm okay with these trade wars. I'm okay with these currency wars. I know that Bitcoin's going to be the great equalizer there. I'm okay with these tariff wars. What I'm not okay with is the profits of the military-industrial complex and the fake narrative and the gaslighting saying, we're the good people, you're the bad people. No, governments are doing bad stuff. And hopefully we're moving to more transparency so we can kill that narrative and we can protect ourselves with Bitcoin, and hopefully they can decide to engage in this game theory anyway. So the Belt and Road Initiative, I covered that a little bit earlier, is currently beating the IMF strategy. 150 countries have signed on to collaboratively work with the Belt and Road Initiative, and the IMF is being exposed as a terrorist organization. That is a problem. That is a big problem, and that's why we're getting all of these problems right now. Hence why America's focusing on its neighbors. And so I think there is a series of events that are going to happen where America focuses on its neighbors, and hopefully that can lead to multipolarity. And the US dollar is a superpower, but it's not a hegemon that causes all this terrorism and everything that happens around the world and death and destruction. So hence Panama was immediately threatened with the tariffs. That was the next one. And what was the end of the negotiation? The end of the negotiation is you need to pull back from working from China. You can't do Belt and Road initiatives. Marco Rubio and Trump said that they're now able to use Freeport with Panama, but the Panama said, no, that's the lifeblood of our economy. And so there was a bit of narrative from Trump, and then Panama said, no, that's not the truth. But it helps it then go to another victory. So we can say Colombia, tick. Mexico, tick. Canada, tick. Panama, tick. And then they go for what they really want to go for, which is one more across Europe. And then what they really want to go through is Greenland and the other things anyway. Anyway, Panama did not build up its Bitcoin strategic reserves. So it had to choose between Belt and Road Initiative, China, America, IMF. And if you read Tales of an Economic Hitman, you know all about what the IMF did and how many they killed from the economic hitmen. Make sure you watch read Confessions of an Economic Hitman, and you go through the whole story of what happened in Panama. This is the type of shit that we need to get rid of. But anyway, the Panama came out with a negotiation, and kind of, if you look at the world right now, China's looking more and more. Remember, I covered this years and years and years ago. I said that the Russian war would be a movement towards Trump getting in again, and then Trump would be a contraction of the dollar to a nationalist vision, and then we move to multipolarity. If you watch any of my emergency broadcasts, if you remember the free Bitcoin Hard Talk membership portal, you'll remember all of those things that we've been covering over the year. Quite a lot of that is playing out. Anyway, and I also said China is going to look more and more like America, and America is going to look more and more like China, and they'll meet in the middle with central bank digital currencies and stable coins. Still think that's happening. And so that seems to be playing out. We'll keep doing that as well. And so Panama came out anyway and said, yeah, we'll pull out a Belt and Road Initiative. You know, fair game. This is trade wars. Panama is flooded with deflationary electric vehicles from China. And so the electric vehicle sales from China is contracting at the moment as a result of the US policy to ensure that these electric vehicles are not sold cheaply because they want inflation instead of deflation. And so, you know, Panama used to be able to get an amazing electric vehicle for 10K. Now there'll be tariffs and there'll be a movement away from that. And you'll have to have the expensive Tesla ones as well. Because now you know that will be the policy of the US first policy. Right. I want to question a little bit in the macro section as well, a bit about this narrative of, is this really communism versus capitalism? So let's just take a little bit of a look at the state of affairs. Now, America does have much, much better freedom of speech. That's why I live in the West, because I love my freedom of speech. You know, we know that the technocrats control it now, and we all know where AI algorithms and where it's going. But at least I get to warn as many people and prepare people for a Bitcoin AI and CBDC world for as long as I can. And we all know where we're heading. And, you know, whether that freedom of speech lasts forever depends upon whether we build, you know, decentralized social networks and Bitcoin becomes that resistance against centralized artificial intelligence, centralized digital identity, centralized central bank digital currencies. And that's a war and the battle we're going to fight together. I don't know who's going to win, but I do know you can protect yourself by owning Bitcoin in self-custody and then go to the country that gives you and exerts the most amount of freedom rather than staying with your central bank if it gets too oppressive. But anyway, let's have a look at the state of affairs. So if you currently look at the Federal Reserve economy, you know, in 1913 took over constitutional America and created a US dollar debt-based Ponzi scheme that now has $36 trillion of debt and $250 trillion of liabilities, you know, that exist today, you know, like Medicare, Social Security, $1 trillion of interest in debt, $1 trillion to the military-industrial complex, creating an attack budget rather than a defense budget, as we now know. But the US government, it currently employs 4 million people. Okay, so what is that? Relative to the whole population of workers in America, that's 2.5% of the workforce is employed by the US government. China government, in terms of employment, it's got approximately 56 million people. So that is, you know, they had the CCP, which was originally communism. They transitioned to capitalism, but they didn't want large companies taking over their industry, and they kept control of energy resources, state banking, and various telecommunications, which is why you get bad freedom of speech because of that. But that 56 million people is approximately 7.2%. So you got 2.5%, 7.2%, 5% difference. We're told that this one's meant to be communism. Communism is where everyone's employed by the government and you don't get any property rights. Well, that doesn't sound like communism. That's not the Soviet Union. Anyway, 7.2% of the workforce. So why are we still being fed that narrative? Well, because China still calls it the China Communist Party, even though it's got no connection to communism. Yeah, totalitarianism, but it's not the economic model of what Karl Marx created, which was the ideology used by Wall Street and the Federal Reserve to de-topple Russia with the Bolshevik Revolution, based upon that invasion to create the Soviet Union in the first place. So let's look at US government spending. It's 24.8% of GDP. So a quarter of all spending in the US is government. The China government spending is historically around 30 to 35% of GDP. So at best, it's 10% more than America. But that doesn't sound like communism. We need to get these governments as small as possible, and hopefully Bitcoin can contribute to that. But 25% to 35% at worst? Really? This is the boogie monster? US debt to GDP. America is thanks to the Federal Reserve System, America is 125% debt to GDP. Who benefited from that? The shareholders of the Federal Reserve. So they create the digital dollar every time they issue a loan, and they get a special subsidy. And that's why in 1913, you needed the Income Tax Act at the same time as the Federal Reserve Act. And so China debt, what is that? China debt to GDP, 27%. So a state banking system leads to less indebtedness, less inflation. Now, there is a challenge with the amount of debt that they've pumped into real estate in China, and America will use that narrative to say you don't need to worry about China. We need to worry about the threat of communism, which is why we need to defend through military rather than economic. And Trump is saying, no, let's compete through economic. Let's do tariffs. So this is a recognition of the old narratives that we're fed. So China debt to GDP is significantly better, 27 to 30% projected in 2025. China has 80 to 90% monopoly on rare minerals. And this is what it's about. What are the rare minerals needed? They are required as the input for semiconductor chips. And semiconductor chips are needed in order to power artificial intelligence, which also requires electricity, which requires natural gas, which also requires rare minerals that China has a massive monopoly on, which is the lithium that's needed for electric vehicle batteries. Hence the Elon Musk interest in switching from a Democrat to a Republican and being used as a tool in order to push the narratives that lead to the nationalist ideology by saying it's a Democrat issue and Republicans are going to drain the swamp. And again, they are, which is awesome. And they can weaponize that in order to get the resources that are needed and retreat back from dollar dominance in the to multipolar, which is what we need for peace. But there are forces that don't want that. The globalists don't want that. So this is what we need to expose. And this is what we'll always follow the money for in Bitcoin Hard Talk. So US has the world reserve currency. That is their power. China has the rare minerals monopoly. They have to trade with each other. But BRICS needs de-dollarization in order to achieve that. So when Trump is using tariffs to weaponize against its partners and sanctions to weaponize against its partners, that's driving the BRICS corridor to everyone want to use non-dollars to trade with each other, which is creating more power to the BRICS side, even if they don't launch the currency. And then they could launch the currency and back it by Bitcoin. And then America could say, we'll do the Bitcoin strategic reserves to fight against the Fed because we're 125 debt to GDP when Russia's 22% and China's 25%. This is why Bitcoin becomes the power play, because that is a deleveraging mechanism And when you can use it as collateral with stable coins, you can deleverage the banking system. But the fiat currency proof of weapons network wants you to be on a central bank digital currency. Get the game? Yes, this is what we need to be protecting ourselves from. And this is what we need to understand. So that de-dollarization movement is pushing the global south together. So why do we need to do all of these old covert operations that now everyone's figuring out? Because I've been watching BitcoinHardTalk and all the other people that reveal this stuff that I use in order to learn from as well, that were called tinfoil hats because of the CIA Operation Mockingbird. And then you can put crazy conspiracy theories out. And then when people try and actually use, this is what intelligence agencies do, they can say, oh, you're a conspiracy theorist because there's the wacky ones. And then they can combine it with saying, oh, no, don't criticize the deep state. Don't criticize Mossad. You're anti-Semitic. We're de-weaponizing those tools right now because now it's all being revealed and becoming self-evident. Anyway, the US needs to return to the real dollar pre-1913. And maybe, just maybe, Bitcoin is creating that type of environment where even if they don't know it, America could move to pre-constitutional dollar before the central banks, before the European central banks created the debt-based Ponzi scheme. And maybe, just maybe, the BRICS competing de-dollarization movement could end up solving its unit problem because it wanted to back it at 40% gold. And the reason the price of gold is going up is because there's a repatriation of European gold over to America, like there was pre-World War I and in the interwar period between World War I and World War II. That's happening again. And China, Russia, and other BRICS members are accumulating. They're saying they don't want to launch a competing currency. They'd rather just do the BRICS trading route. But de-dollarization is forcing them because there's sanctions and maybe tariffs will be a movement towards that as well. Anyway, both roads lead to Bitcoin. And these Bitcoin strategic reserves, you get to front run it. This is the most interesting time to break the proof of weapons network as well. So US seems to be executing what's called a Plaza Accord 2.0. And I spend, shout out to on X. I join a bunch of finance people to give the daily things on X. Make sure you're following me on X if you're not. Anytime I jump on a space, we can actually interact and speak with each other. But one of the people that I do that with, he's got an alias name. He's been telling everyone about this Plaza Accords 2.0. And I researched it a little bit further. But it is and does make a lot of sense. It is about weakening the dollar in order to support America, which is a resistance against the Federal Reserve that wants to keep the dollar reserve currency for as long as possible so that the Fed can have a globalist policy and weaponize the Bank for International Settlements network. That's my wording. They do it less conspiratorial. But this is about weakening the dollar. Now, that is not happening right now. The dollar is strong, because the current policy is to create wealth inequality, wipe out the middle class, and hand over all the assets to the rich people at the expense of everyday Americans and export inflation globally so that the IMF loans can be used and the IMF policy can be used to inflate away people's currencies, convert them into dollar and prop up the dollar. And then war is needed in order to prop that up, helps the IMF and the covert operations that you're seeing. So to understand tariffs today, and this is complex, so everybody wants to simplify, but this is a massive geopolitical chessboard. And I got to be honest, I don't think anyone fully understands it. People might pretend to understand it, but it's a big chessboard. And people want to think that, that there's one big plan. I think these centralized leaders are just implementing and winging things as much as they can wing at the moment. But there are basically, two agendas that are happening with America and the world reserve currency. So there's something called the Tiffin dilemma. The Triffin dilemma. Sorry, I remember this one in economics, but I needed to remind myself. And there are Trump's goals. Trump's goals are completely inconsistent with reality. You can't have lower inflation, a world reserve currency, a smaller budget, a shrinking national debt, drill baby drill, tariffs globally, and still maintain America and achieve all those goals simultaneously. Not possible. And so what he promised is not possible, but he is draining the swamp so far. And so we'll take it. So you got Trump's goals. And what did we learn about Trump from how he did crypto? He focuses on profits for himself first. So is he aligning? What is Trump's best interest? Trump's a real estate guy. Real estate guys need lower rates because it serves their real estate empire. So while he wants all of that, what he really wants is low rates. Low rates creates more wealth inequality. That drives dollar demand. And that strengthens the dollar relative to all other currencies. And the only way to fight that back and get lower rates is to use tariffs. Now, I'm not sure whether he's figured this out, whether this is a whole 5D chess strategy, but following the money a little bit, it kind of makes sense. So this only makes sense if tariffs are a temporary negotiation tool, which is so far what they have been. Are they actually going to be implemented? I think not. And I think other people think not as well. That's not a revelation from me, but that's just following what really happened. The permanent solution is actually building Bitcoin strategic reserves, as we've already covered. Tariffs is the temporary solution. And so that's why it still plays my narrative and belief that this is going to be Fed versus Trump administration. Because Bitcoin can fix the dollar at the treasury side. I mean, it's a big thing. Doesn't fix the Fed. So how does the Triffin dilemma work anyway? So I dusted off the old economics textbook and use a bit of AI to remind myself. And so basically the Triffin dilemma is as follows. The world reserve currency basically gives exorbitant privileges to whoever runs it. This was the British Empire. This is now the US Empire. It means that everyone needs to convert their transactions. It means you can export inflation globally, and it creates that dollar milkshake theory where everyone ends up lending to your government because your capital market is the best, and everyone has demand for dollars, and they end up, really destroying their own economy and supporting the Federal Reserve, and the banking system gets to benefit from it. It's by financial transactions and trade, basically. So in order to achieve that, the dollar always has to be overvalued because there's a constant flow of foreign currencies to buy the dollar. And so this is what you're seeing in right now. You're seeing a weakening of the pound, a weakening of the euro longer term relative to the dollar. Why is that? Because they need to hold more dollars in reserve to protect their economies. And that pushes US capital markets, and that increases the ability to lend to the US government. And then the US government can reinvest in more military might, $1 trillion of military might, but they do it based upon debt. And so they have to run a trade deficit. And so the US dollar becomes debt. And you can't reduce the debt without crashing the economy. And so it is a temporary, long-term privilege, but the privilege ends. And this is the Triffin dilemma, because the deficit must persist forever and it must increase. This is what I've always talked about. You have to have more individual debt. You have to have more corporate debt. You have to have more government debt. And you need it because you need to supply the world with more and more dollars, euro dollar, petrodollar. And then they start using terrorism, covert operations, CIA, deep state operations, which are now being exposed. Once you have that, the US can borrow cheaper than any other government, which is why they have the lower rates. But the Federal Reserve can artificially push down the short-term rates But we're seeing that the longer term rates, which is 10-year treasuries, are harder to manipulate, but they could be decreased by using tariffs and reducing the demand for the dollar. But then you have to have and give up the world reserve currency. And this is the dilemma. Do you want the world reserve currency, or do you want increased wealth inequality, more and more wealth inequality, until eventually you have civil war, revolution, and then a new world order and a new world empire comes along due to excessive debt because the economy gets too complicated, and the whole world looks at Trump saying, can you solve Ukraine? Can you solve Panama? Can you solve Greenland? Can you solve the Middle East? Can you solve Israel? Can you solve the whole? And no one person can solve it. And this is what led to the fall of the British Empire. It just got too complicated. They had to retreat. They had to give up the world reserve currency, and they had to focus on their internal economy. And the Bank of England bankrupted it, essentially, and handed over its power to the Federal Reserve. And then all the gold went over from all the different operations I've covered in previous broadcasts. Anyway, what the US want, or what Trump wants right now, is it wants to borrow cheaper. When I look at Trump, it wants to borrow cheaper. But how do you get that? Well, you have to give up the world reserve currency, or you have to give up the trade deficit, which leads to a contraction in the economy. So how do you supplement that? Tariffs. And so I'm trying to figure out whether this is fake or real. But either way, this is the same result. That's where tariffs are coming from, I think. So we shall see if it's just negotiation tactics or real. But tariffs are often like a temporary negotiation tool, as I see, to achieve a goal, or it can be a long-term in order to achieve a removal of the world reserve currency. But the ultimate goal is essentially to have multilateral agreements, which is what's been happening between your neighbors, and retreating to a multipolar world. So all of this leads to the theses that I've always been talking about in Bitcoin Hard Talk in the macro and geopolitical section. Is I believe that this is a movement to multipolarity, because the dollar continuing on its path takes us to World War III. Could this prevent World War III? This is what we have to watch. And this is why we have to protect ourselves with Bitcoin. Anyway, you can use tariffs in order to weaken the dollar if they're real, or you can use it to temporarily get the negotiations. This is what we see. This is what Plaza Accord was. Plaza Accord was a deliberate strategy to weaken the dollar. And this could be Plaza Accord 2.0, depending on whether it's real or just negotiation tactics. But again, how do I know? What is the actual goal of Trump? Trump's goal is to lower the long-term borrowing cost, 10-year treasuries, which is going up and has contracted slightly since the tariffs have come into play. And so this is why I, again, think that the Federal Reserve is going to try and work against this agenda, and stable coins would be the mechanism, which is why stablecoin regulations, for using a new tool against the Federal Reserve. And then using the Bitcoin Strategic Reserve in order to build its own collateral base and fight against any international trends that allow other countries to beat it. So we are in Bitcoin game theory, exactly as we pointed out in many multiple times. The demand for Bitcoin, again, if you're selling less than 100K because you're worried about trying to make more dollars trading, you got it wrong. You got it really wrong. You have to be an insider to play that game. And investing is the great equalizer. And, this is why later I'm going to make sure in the Bitcoin Wealth Builder program, I publish online exactly what everyone can do in order to protect themselves in a world of Bitcoin AI and central bank digital currencies. Anyway, Trump's agenda is to get rates down to protect real estate so he can borrow more as he builds stable coins, DeFi, tokenized real world assets, NFTs, meme coins, a deregulating environment for crypto stablecoin regulations. And Trump just follows the profit. So when we go to the geopolitical section, to try and get my head around what Trump is actually doing and be less emotional, because I definitely was triggered by his comments on Gaza, all we need to do is look at Trump's profits. And that's my new model in trying to figure out what Trump's actually doing. So don't listen to what he says. Look at what he does, which has always been my methodology anyway. But this is going to be my new methodology for Trump. He's here to make as much money as possible. And that's the model. He'll tell you it's America first. And maybe it will be America first if you align your interest with him. But that means you've got to align your interest with him. And he is pumping a Bitcoin ETF. He's buying Bitcoin. He's pumping these different stablecoin strategies. And so if you're not in this market, then you're betting against Trump. And I wouldn't bet against Trump in terms of aligning his interest with his policies and what he's pushing for. Okay. So anyway, I trust Trump to always focus on his profits. And that's what I think we're going to see. I'll test this theory throughout the administration for the next 4 years. And it's interesting because he's not going to be reelected. He's at that age. This will be his last one. So he can do whatever he wants. And we have met peak centralization in the world. His negotiation with MBS, his negotiations, with Xi Jinping. We've hit peak centralization. A few people at the Bank of Japan, Bank of England, IMF, the deep state, and a resistance with Bitcoin against it is fighting centralization with decentralization. And what do they want? How are they fighting you? Trying to persuade you to put your Bitcoin in their custody so they can profit wherever it goes. And so they are hedging. The globalists are hedging in every single way possible. And this is definitely one of the most interesting times in financial history. I think Trump is trying to push Jerome Powell to pushing rates, shorter term rates. He's using tariffs to look at longer term rates. And he's realizing that you can't push the Fed because Jerome Powell said, you can't fire me. It's against the law, even though Congress can if they wanted. And so he's saying, all right, cool. Let's use stable coins. Let's use crypto. Let's build tools. Let's use Bitcoin. And that could take you to ending the Fed. Delusion? Fine. All the things I talked about years ago were delusion. As I was telling people that what Bitcoin could do in 2011, you call it delusion. Eventually, it gets laughed at, ridiculed, and accepted as self-evident. Got some things wrong, but Bitcoin allows you to do this. And that's why I would implore you to support me in getting to 100,000 subscribers by sharing this with your family, getting more and more people to walk. Look, many people have left in the comments. I read your comments. They were saying, I don't need to watch anything all week because you give me all of the geopolitical stuff, all of the macro stuff, all of the Bitcoin stuff in one place. I just need to watch it for a couple of hours and it saves me all the time of trawling through all the news. You're welcome. Help me get this message out, get me past 100K subscribers so I can stop being censored, get that blue tick. And now that there has never been a better time with all the exposure of my message that YouTube might start, I don't do this. I don't monetize or anything. I don't give a damn about that, but I want this message to get out as much as possible. And I need you to help me get past 100K. Been stuck at 91K ever since they started censoring me. Okay, so tariffs weaken the dollar. It reduces the deficit. And at the same time, there is a Bitcoin strategic reserve and a stable coin system being built. I'm going to follow the money. And that's why I think I'm betting against the Federal Reserve winning here. But at the same time, it doesn't matter. Because even if the Federal Reserve wins, you can protect yourself with Bitcoin. Unfortunately, those that don't own Bitcoin, unfortunately, I don't think enough people own Bitcoin. That's our job. Our job is to get more people to own Bitcoin. Because we're building a network of people that are going to be protected from this stuff. We're going to be ready for a world of Bitcoin AI and CBDCs. They're not. We need more people to own it. Help people get off zero Bitcoin. It's a service to humanity. Boycott the Federal Reserve. Don't let them win and protect yourself even if they do win. Okay. But their winning takes us to World War III. I don't want to go to World War III. Our winning takes us to artificial intelligence being being decentralized and open source. Bitcoin taught us the story to freedom. Governments do not take us to freedom. Central banks take us away from freedom. And we can support ourselves, our companies and our governments and central banks like the Czech Republic one, they can decide, I'll build some Bitcoin reserves into that central bank. I can fight against the ECB. Not passionate about it, don't want it to happen. I don't want central banks to have more power, but the cost of having a decentralized network was that anyone can use it. But fortunately, proof of work meant it doesn't matter who owns it. Beautiful. Satoshi Nakamoto, I will forever be grateful for the gift that you gave to the world in supporting us in transitioning from this world of proof of weapons based upon deceit and violence into a potentially much, much more peaceful world where we can trade with each other and align interest and harness Bitcoin as the mechanism for never weaponizing a global reserve currency and taking us to a much, much more game theoretical world anyway. Well, I'll continue to be deluded and continue to report on what may happen. You just need to protect yourself, whether what I say happens or not. Okay, this is all bringing us to monetary reform, stable coins, Bitcoin reserves. You could even use a tax cut. When you have, this is what the world used to look like before central banks. You didn't need income tax in those days. Maybe we can get there. This is crazy. Maybe. Let's see. But anyway, you just need assets that can beat that, which is what the Bitcoin network does, and anyone can play that game. Spend less than you earn. Save the rest in Bitcoin and build a strategy to make more sovereignty for yourself as well. Okay. Anyway, we haven't even started the geopolitical section. How are we doing? Wow, 2 hours in. I'm getting really bad at this. I might actually cut the geopolitical section a little bit shorter, but we'll see how we get in. Anyway, I hope you're enjoying it. Like it if you are, retweet it if you are, reshare it if you are. Right. So anyway, this system, I think we're witnessing the change anyway. Now, we're also seeing America turn on its allies. That's a side effect that comes from this. But they're going to be weaker. So what's Europe going to do? Europe needs to recognize that the Fed first policy doesn't work. America is America first. Europe needs to be Europe first. The ECB is a Fed first strategy. Europe needs strategic reserves. UK needs Bitcoin strategic reserves. Germany needs Bitcoin strategic reserves. Everybody needs Bitcoin strategic reserves to fight against the ECB and the Fed first policy. And then you can do what El Salvador does. You had to take the 3.5 billion, but you can restructure your way out of it. Eventually, fiat currencies, they have to choose currency debasement. That is what, that is what buying Bitcoin is. It's protecting your economy while debasing and being able to deleverage without all of the destruction that needs to happen. Now, can our leaders figure it out? I'm not confident. Will they take us to a war instead? Well, that's what history has done. But at least we know it exists. And hopefully Bitcoin game theory just takes people to the same conclusion. Essentially, both sides of this, the countries that are being crippled by the dollar, they get to protect themselves using Bitcoin. And Bitcoin can be used in order to demonetize and not have, this crazy. And America can focus on America first, its neighbors, and figuring out how to have less covert operations and just trade and negotiate and work more overtly, which is what we're seeing right now. In reaction to that, we're already seeing it play out. Trump is trying to get rates down. He'll be doing a lot more posturing. Jerome Powell said, no, inflation isn't under control. We're not cutting rates. Trump is saying, you got 100 days to figure out all the crypto and Bitcoin stuff. Let's move fast. He wants his tools. The Bank of England is being destroyed because it's still doing a Fed first policy. What did the Bank of England do? is cutting rates in order to stimulate the economy. So it cut rates from 4.75% to 4.5% so it could give its people some relief on their mortgages and try and stimulate the economy through debt. You're going to see more and more rate cuts. The Bank of Japan, which is the piggy bank, they're saying we need to focus on our people. So you've got America that is going to be trying pressurized to cut rates, tools to compete with that, strategic reserves. Everyone else having an oppressive economy, needing to cut rates as well to stimulate the economy through indebtedness. This is how the proof of weapons network was designed. Trump wants to drive down rates and the price of oil. He wants more gas for artificial intelligence. China has said we can do it cheaper. We can now achieve more artificial intelligence. But the price of oil, as we said, if he gets drill baby drill down to $40, that bankrupts American oil trade. So that would need to be subsidized. How would that be subsidized? Universal basic income through either stable coins, because he doesn't want to give Powell the power. And so they're going through those CBDC bans. But he'll give it over to Elon. He'll give it over to Zuckerberg. Why do you think at his inauguration, you had Amazon there, Google there? Gold is the asset of the central banks, the centralized asset. Bitcoin is the decentralized asset. And this is the resistance that we are seeing. The proof of weapons network is protecting itself through gold. Gold is reaching new all-time highs. I think we had 2,850, 2,900 is ripping because central banks are trying to protect themselves from the fact that governments could fight back with Bitcoin. And individuals, companies, and governments and central banks are using Bitcoin. This is a shift of the US relationship with the world. And that's why we got US aid that came out right now. US aid is exposing the old system. It says it's time to tell the truth. Too many people know. The gig is up. Let's just tell everybody the truth. And at least they can talk about it on spaces and everywhere. And we can at least get their data for AI, give them freedom of speech, and just drain the swamp. For the first time, Marco Rubio said that we are now in a multipolar world. That would never have been said under Antony Blinken. Now, Trump can't say that because he needs to say, we need to be world reserve currency. He probably is pushing for that. But the Triffin dilemma won't allow it to happen. It's going multipolar. Marco Rubio is saying that as well. So this is a change in narrative. This is very positive. This brings us closer to peace, not further away as we were. Anyway, US will be another superpower. I want it to be as powerful as possible in a pre-Federal Reserve economy. Love the American Constitution. If we can get back to that, it can be another superpower, but there's more superpower. The world is not the same. The tactics that used to be used are causing problems, and this is exactly what we have experienced anyway. I believe that we are shifting to a post-American dominance world order, and tariffs is the mechanism, and Trump is the person to deliver the message and the spokesperson to make America feel good about it under a MAGA thing, because everyone's fed up of the deep state. And they want nationalism. They don't want their money going to Israel. They don't want their money going to Ukraine. They don't want to be detoppling regimes. They don't want to be paying for human trafficking. They don't want to be paying for drug trafficking. They don't want to be paying for pedophilia blackmail rings anymore. I think Israel's going to try and again, not the Israeli people. I don't think they know about this, but the Israeli government, which was a mechanism of the deep state set up by MI6 in the first place when the Rothschilds wanted to negotiate in order to bring America into the war, which led to the Balfour Declaration and a weaponization of the Jewish faith to use the word anti-Semitism to justify this deep state agenda by having a jurisdiction where you can manage these different criminal rings and blackmail rings using Israel America and US deep state outside of parliamentary and congressional approval, as I've always been revealing throughout these Bitcoin hard talks as well. And the sooner people recognize that, then we can stop engaging in supporting these deep state apparatus, because they're killing people. And this is why I think Netanyahu came over in order to protect the status quo, and Trump delivered a message. He said, you know that genocide you were trying to hide? I'm going to tell everyone now, Gaza has been destroyed. All the hospitals, all the hotels, all of the infrastructure, all of the universities, all of the schools. 600,000 of them have gone. It's a death zone. It's a destruction zone. All the things that the Israel government and Mossad and the deep state were trying to say, that didn't happen. That didn't happen. No, they're doing precision targeting. He said it in front of Netanyahu, knowing that the person next to him was the person that did it. And he's looking pretty ill at the moment. We always knew, if you follow the money, that Netanyahu was going to be the fall guy. And he's grinning like a Cheshire cat, because Trump said and came in and said, I'm going to take over Gaza. America's going to own it. Now, the most triggering speeches that at one time I fell for the trigger, and I was, I allowed emotions to get the better of me. But then I thought about what I think this is doing and came up with my whole thought: just follow the prophets of Trump. If we carry on this path of actually having America occupy Gaza, we just saw with all the hostage swaps already, we've seen it. Sorry, macro's going into geopolitics. I'm finding it a bit hard. I'll do a shift soon, because we've got to do Greenland and stuff as well. Hope you're still enjoying it. Hope you're still got the attention. Make sure you share, make sure you like, make sure you retweet. We'll have a little bit of water break soon on geopolitics side. Just so much to cover. The news flow is too much. But if we continue on this path where US occupies, we've already seen that the resistance against Israeli occupation is bigger than it was before October the 7th. You can't just kill people and expect people not to want to resist. And that's what's happening. And so America can't occupy. They went into Iraq and they went into Afghanistan and took 20 years and $2 trillion of profits for the military industrial complex to replace the Taliban with Taliban. And now USAID reveals that was all bribe network in order to get the money back, and they were pushing the drug agendas. Like, it's all revealed now. So if US puts boots on the ground, it needs to focus on its borders. It's not the same thing. It's an illusion of superpower. There will be a resistance, and that resistance will be weaponized, just like October the 7th was, just like 9/11 was, in order to push Israeli foreign policy. And Israeli foreign policy is regime change within Iran, when all you need to do is do a negotiation with Iran. And that brings us to much of what the geopolitical stuff. We could go for the World War III agenda. We could carry on doing that. But I personally believe this was the exposure of Netanyahu. Trump did it standing next to him, whether it was a strategy or not. And Trump just went out for the most outrageous thing. And there's no chance in hell that US will be able to take over Gaza. The MAGA crew are all like, we want to own Gaza. We want to own Gaza. We love it. No chance. It's not going to happen. That would be war with Iran. That would be Netanyahu pushing you. Those boots on the ground would be resisted. Americans will start dying. And then narratives of the fake war on terror 2.0 will start going. You'll end up with more border injections through NED and the National Endowment for Democracy. You have colored revolutions, and you'll have a globalist agenda that will lead to the fall of the dollar and all the violence that comes from that. Hell no. That's what the Israeli government want, because they want to use Trump to deliver what he promised with that 150 million that he took. And I think all he's given them so far is narratives. They're happy about it. But as long as America doesn't occupy Gaza, then I don't think we need World War III. And now let's play the geopolitics. Let's understand what's actually going on here. So this is now part 3. I'm sorry how long this is taking. I hope you're still engaged. Do me a favor. I'm trying to get to 100,000 subscribers. Hit the subscribe button, hit the bell symbol, hit all, share this with other people, retweet. I want as many people to understand these trends so they don't have to be fooled by all of the covert operations that are happening to scam you into war. And I hope you can join me by sharing this message, reposting, and hitting that subscribe button. If everyone that watched this subscribed, I'd get my additional 9K subscribers. I'd be over 100K subscribers. And then I can get YouTube, now that all of these messages are being uncensored, to give me a blue check. And then we can start getting the algorithms again. And hopefully I won't be, now hopefully this is what the administration wants to do now that we're revealing it all. Okay, right. Let me take a quick water break. Like, share, retweet, add a comment while we do this. We're going to go into part 3, geopolitics. And this has been a long one, but we still got more to go. I hope if you're still watching, I promise you, I'm going to give you the geopolitical side that will help you. I'm more positive over what we're seeing right now, and I'll warn you of when we're going down the negative route.